Hello and welcome to Tank It AFE News. My name's Tom and it's Sunday afternoon here in coronavirus land, which means being stuck at home, so might as well make a video, huh? Today's 80s collectible drinking glass is, this was, I think Taco Bell did a Star Trek 3. Spock Lives is this one in the series. Funny thing about these collectible glasses, it's never the movie you really want. Like, they didn't make a Star Trek 2 one, which would be really cool. It's usually like the second or third movie in a series where they finally decided to market a collectible glass. Anyhow, today's t-shirt is for Red Wing hockey fans. We got the Bruise brothers, Joey Kosar and Bob Probert. But we're not here to talk about Star Trek glasses or Red Wings hockey as much as I'd like to. We're here to talk about tanks. And today I am thinking about the Leopard, the German Leopard. Why? Because I just got a couple books on the topic earlier this month. And I'll be honest, looking back, there's not really been a ton published in English on the Leopard. I don't think it's a tank that has captured the public imagination nearly, even remotely close to the extent that World War II German tanks did. And that's pretty obvious because the Leopard's really not seen a whole lot of combat. It's seen some use in combat areas, but I can't think of a single tank battle that's involved Leopard ones. Anyhow, the books that I picked up, Modern Combat Vehicles number 3. This is a series from sort of late 70s, early 80s. This one's Leopard. And yeah, it's a Leopard 2 on the cover, but the book's published in 81, so the book's almost entirely on the Leopard 1, not the Leopard 2. I don't know anything about A.J. Barker. I picked this one up because it's cheap, frankly. It was a used copy in pretty good condition for under $10, so what the heck. And it's got some good information in it. It's definitely worth, price of a fast food combo meal, really. I mean, can't complain with that. And then the other one I got was a Leopard 1, main battle tank from the Haynes Manual series. The Haynes series, these are, despite being a little, the whole idea of the Haynes Manual on a tank is kind of a little bit of a gimmick because obviously these aren't actual, repair manuals, but they're nice reference books. I enjoy them, find them usually worth picking up. This one is by Michael Shackleton, who wrote a much larger 3-volume set on the Leopard that was published by Barbarossa Books, I believe. And I don't have that one. Used copies of those are going for about $50 per volume. So at 3 volumes, that's like $150 to buy the set. I don't have that kind of money to spend on a book on a tank that's not really within my primary zone of interest, which is more World War II stuff. But anyhow, so yeah, so I read those 2 recently, went back and looked at some of the other stuff. Quite a bit also interesting stuff on the Leopard in my old copy of International Defense Review. This was sort of a compilation they did sort of in the late 70s of all the different articles on tanks from that era. Lots of really good stuff in here. Unfortunately, I've tried to find a better, this copy's literally falling apart. It's been eaten by mice. Tried to find a better copy. These things just don't exist on the used book market. International Defense Review, it's kind of one of those high-priced things that subscriptions that usually it's more like organizations and companies get, not so much individuals. So it's really hard finding that stuff. I wish it was easier. So what did I want to say about the Leopard? Well, mostly I wanted to take on this idea that you sort of saw, especially at the time when it was introduced. It's summarized I would say by this quote, which I found in going through old issues of Armor magazine. So the 1966 issue of Armor, September-October issue, says, "The Leopard is a direct descendant of the Mark V Panther and the Mark VI Tiger tanks of latter World War II." Let's grab a Tiger. Okay. Yeah, we got a Tiger 1 here. If you can tell me what it has in common with this Leopard 1, get him in the picture, I'd like to know. These are very different vehicles. And you say, well, maybe he's talking more about Panthers. Okay, the Tiger 2, this 70-ton monster compared to this thing, which was originally designed to be a 30-ton tank. I'm not seeing the Tiger connection there. And you say, well, really, it's intended to be more like the Panther. So here's the sort of final iteration of the Panther, what it was just called, the F, with the small turret. This didn't even actually go into production. And comparing to this, there's still a lot of differences. These are very different vehicles, and they should be. There's 20 years difference. there's also an entire generation of tanks separating these two. This is a late World War II tank. This is a second generation post-war tank. So there's a whole generation of first generation post-war tanks between these. And the Germans, what was their first generation post-war tank? Basically, it was this, US M48 or an M47. They didn't have their own design in the first generation of post-war tanks, out sort of late 40s, early 50s, really late, almost early 60s, because this thing doesn't come around until mid 60s in terms of production. So this is a German tank in the 1950s. It's American made, but this is what the Germans are using. And so, you know, this is going to have some influence. This is what they're using. This is the design. This is what their designers are looking at as an example of a modern tank, and they're going to get ideas from it. And you know, they're going to have also the ideas and concepts that they've come up with themselves, and they're going to come up with, like with any country that designs stuff, you look at what everybody else is doing, you borrow ideas where it makes sense, combine them with your own ideas, and you create something that is. Obviously, the Leopard is a very German tank, but it includes influences from the outside. But it's certainly not a direct descendant. To me, direct descendant implies the tank that comes right after that is influenced by those World War II designs. It is a design that's definitely influenced by the German experience in World War II. I mean, so the Bundeswehr, some of the generals that are in charge of setting up the Bundeswehr are guys who have World War II experience. They're bringing their experience from World War II, in particular the Eastern Front, and applying that to what they want to see in a German tank design. But they're not saying we want tanks like we had in World War II. If anything, they're saying something very different. They're saying we want something that's got firepower first and lots of mobility and is reliable. Or we're not so much worried about armor. We don't want another, a Tiger tank. You know, what they sometimes I've seen referred to as a moving van. Big boxy thing that we have to throw on a train to get to the battlefield. So. And, also the fact of the matter is that the Leopard is a tank that was created by the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. West Germany, obviously, is a very different country than World War II era Nazi Germany. It's different geographically, it's different politically, and the Bundeswehr is a very different army than the German Wehrmacht, thank God. So the tank they're going to produce is going to be different. So let's look at it and sort of go through some of the more specifics of the design and what the Leopard looks like to a certain extent. Now, and specifically looking at differences between the World War II German stuff. First off, the tank that would become the Leopard, there were a couple different prototypes that the Germans were looking at, and the one that would become the Leopard was primarily a product of Porsche. Now, Porsche is a funny company in that during World War II, they're involved in tank design, but very few of the tanks that actually are being used in the field are Porsche designs. Porsche has, and let's grab a few here, they got all sorts of crazy stuff. So they've got the Porsche Tiger, which doesn't really ever go, it goes into production but doesn't get adopted for service. I think literally one of these was used as a command tank for a unit of these. The old Ferdinand, named after Ferdinand Porsche, later Elephant. And these vehicles are very different than most of the German designs of the period, mechanically, automotively, whatever, and very strange. Later on, Porsche tries to get into the Tiger 2 competition. Tiger 2 competition Porsche things. He gets this thing and these things. And, of course, these don't get accepted for service either, although they start building turrets, or Krupp does, and they end up on the early jobs. And then, of course, the most famous Porsche tank of World War II is this guy. This is the Maus. And obviously, I don't think you can see a whole lot of similarities between these. This is a very interesting vehicle if you start getting into the nitty-gritty of the design. It's Dr. Porsche was a genius in coming up with interesting concepts. Doesn't mean they were all practical. This one certainly wasn't, but when Hitler says, make me a gigantic super tank, which is a ridiculous concept to begin with, basically, when you're talking about something in this weight range, but there's some really interesting technical concepts and solutions in here. but they did not carry over into post-war tank design. So Porsche comes up with this, with the Leopard, and the Leopard is very, I would say it's a very conservative design in a lot of ways. It is, when you look at it, there's really nothing to criticize or that's particularly really weird. You know, you look at other tanks of that generation, like the British Chieftain. It's got a pretty weird engine and a pretty unsuccessful one. It's got, you know, this 120mm gun, which is different than everybody else is using. You got the Swedish S-Tank, which, I mean, that whole thing is just bizarre. You know, you got the US M60, which is kind of an improvement on our old M48. This thing is sort of a modern, very good all-around tank. And there's nothing, but like I said, there's nothing that really jumps out at you as unusual. It's like I said, it's fairly conservative design in the way, in its conception. And the Germans have incorporated a number of different concepts and ideas that were not in World War II German tank design, but had become the norm by the post-war period. Number one, they finally got the transmission in the back of the tank. All of the wartime German stuff's got the transmission in the front. So the Panther, you see the drive sprockets in the front, with the Leopard that's finally in the rear, along with everything else. The other thing with the Leopard, which is very different than their wartime stuff, is the entire power pack, the transmission and engine, are made to come out of the tank extremely easily and quickly. That is completely different than wartime German stuff. I mean, if you've seen what is involved in taking the transmission out of this guy, a World War II German Tiger, transmission's up here, what do you got to do? You got to take the whole turret off, get a huge gantry crane, and pull the transmission out through the turret ring after you've removed the seats and all the stuff in there. With the Leopard, you can pull the power pack out in a matter of minutes, or so they claim. So, again, it was the World War. In a lot of ways, the Leopard was built as something to be very different than fix a lot of the errors of World War II German tank design. The suspension and track system on the Leopard is where you can definitely see the influence of American design. If you look at the suspension and tracks on a US M48 and then you look at the Leopard, you can the influence is fairly obvious. The track design's very similar. You know, the sort of road wheel design's pretty similar in concept. It's a basic single torsion bar design. The Leopard is a better suspension than on the M48 M60 series. The suspension, I think, of all the second generation post-war tanks, this had the best travel on the road wheel as far as the suspension travel. Very good mobility for its era, but it is very similar in overall concept to the US system. Very different than the torsion bar suspension in this creature. So this has got large road wheels, no return rollers, overlapping interleaved wheels. The track design's quite a bit different. This has got a twin torsion bar suspension on each unit, so there's like 32 torsion bars in this thing. It's crazy, you know, whereas this has got 7 times 2, so 14 torsion bars versus 32 in the wartime Panther. So yes, suspension's very different. Okay, so on to engines and powertrain. So with this is one of those cases where it looks like there's more continuity than there is, because so all the World War II German tanks had a Maybach engine pretty much. And the company that was Maybach is now part of MTU, which is a large German diesel engine manufacturer, and they make the engines for the Leopard 1 and 2. Now the engine itself is a bit different. The World War II German stuff was, by the end they're using a 12-cylinder gasoline engine, water-cooled. It's a little interesting. It looks at the end of the war that there was interest on the part of the Germans to start developing some diesel engines and some air-cooled engines. So air cooling was something that they saw as advantageous, which I guess makes sense when you're fighting in places like, I mean, by the end of the war they're out of North Africa, but the North African experience, or the steppes of Russia, where water's not a particularly plentiful resource, or if you're in the frigid climates of of northern Russia in the winter, having coolant freeze on you is probably not much fun. And when the Leopard, the original specification according to these books, said that they wanted a air-cooled engine, but they ended up with a water-cooled diesel for the Leopard, a 10-cylinder, which is a little different. 10-cylinder is not quite as common. I think most people are more familiar with 12 and 8-cylinder engines for large AFV designs. And the Leopard 1 and also the engine in the Leopard 2 for that matter are built by MTU, but they were not designed by MTU. They're Mercedes-Benz engines. That's why the designation is MB838 or MB873 for the Leopard 1 and 2 engines, whereas the newer MTU engines are MT, so like the MT883. That's in some of their more modern offerings, like the Power Pack for the America 4 or the Tropicalized Leclerc, I think. So it's kind of funny. Those companies have all been kind of smushed together at this point, like so many other things in the defense industry where there's been huge amounts of consolidation. But different companies designing the engines, so Maybach and Mercedes-Benz. And of course, like we said, Porsche was not heavily involved in tank design other than some of the weird stuff that never really got adopted during World War II. As far as firepower, the Leopard 1 has the British 105 gun. So that's one where, the Germans had been looking at designing their own gun. I mean, the French went that way with the AMX-30, but, the Germans kind of did the practical thing and said, hey, everybody's adopting the British 105. It's a great gun. We might as well use it. And it is a bit different than the German gun designs of World War II. Obviously, there's 20 years difference, so you'd expect a lot of different development. What's interesting about German late war gun design is they really were going to just really, really long-barreled guns. So, I mean, if you look at the bore diameter to barrel length ratio, which you usually see expressed by the letter L and then a number, the late war German stuff is really a much longer guns than everybody else. So with the Panther, that 75mm gun, it's a length 70. With the 88 that's on the Panther or the Tiger II, it's length 71. Most other guns in that period are like length 40, length 50 on the Allied side, and most of the post-war stuff. So the 105mm British gun is, I think, a length, I don't remember off the top of my head, 54, 55. The 120mm gun that the Germans developed for the Leopard 2 is like 44. And then they've got the longer version that's been introduced with the Leopard A2A6 or whenever that came into service, and that's, I think, a 56 maybe, if these numbers are wrong, but they're pretty close. But yeah, nobody's gotten close to designing tank guns that are in that like 70 length 70 ratio category. Part of that's because the German gun, the diameters are a little smaller than 88 and 75 was a little smaller than like what the Russians are putting out that time, because they're dealing with 85 and 100mm guns at the end of World War II. But and the German guns are primarily still relying in World War II on, sort of a solid armor-piercing round. Obviously with a ballistic cap and a cap on it probably, but they haven't really done a whole. They're not shooting sable rounds like the British are with their 17 and 6-pounder. They have a composite rigid round, which is similar to the American HVAP, with a tungsten core. But the Germans don't have enough tungsten to really issue it in large numbers. So, whereas the later stuff like the 105 that the British come out with, that thing's really more optimized for sabot and whatnot. So it's almost not really much point comparing World War II guns to stuff that's coming out, like I said, like the post-war stuff, because ammunition is changing. All that technology is changing so much that the gun designs are. As the ammunition changes, what is the ideal characteristic of the gun themselves is changing, is what I'm saying, if that makes sense. And like I said, the Germans have the sense to adopt the 105 British gun. It's the standard. Oddly enough, the British are like, oh, it's not good enough, we want the 120. So, the British come out with this excellent gun, and then they're the first to abandon it. And the US and the Germans stick with the 105 for quite a while. What else can we say about the Leopard, particularly in relation to World War II German tank design? The turret on the Leopard is cast. Unlike every other World War II German design, the Germans didn't really do large-size castings for tank parts during World War II. The Leopard turret, though, is cast, much like the turret on the M48, much like the turret on the AMX-30. Casting had become sort of the norm. And the shape of the Leopard turret is kind of a little bit like the M48, at least on the rear of it, I would say, but it's... I don't know if there's any, how they came up with that shape. I assume it was just their own designers came up with it. It's a very sort of practical, kind of a teardrop. And of course, later on they would come out with a welded turret on the later variants, which is a little more... This looks a little more German to me. It's got that a little more of that boxy quality of the typifies German tank design. What else can we say about the Leopard? The Leopard was certainly one of the most successful tanks of its generation in terms of export sales. Anybody who had the money and that the Germans were willing to sell tanks to, and we have to remember that West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, had kind of more stringent rules. I mean, Germany still does as far as who they're willing to export military equipment to than some other countries. So the countries that generally seem to have the option of buying the Leopard 2, or the Leopard 1, sorry, did. So you're talking like the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, I'm trying to think of the other countries, quite a Canada, but export sales to quite a few different countries. Much more successful than its direct competitor, which was the French AMX-30, because both of these tanks came out of that sort of Euro Panzer idea, concept, requirement that was issued in the 50s. And the tanks are very similar in capabilities. The AMX-30 is a smaller vehicle. It's definitely a little more quirky in certain ways. It's got some interesting concepts. It's but, it's in general, in the testing, mobility-wise, it wasn't quite as good as the Leopard. The transmission is not known for being particularly reliable. It's also got its own sort of... It doesn't have the French decided to make their own 105 gun, which is kind of odd. So the AMX-30, while it did well as well in the export market, generally it went to the countries that couldn't get Leopards, kind of, for whatever reason. But... quite a few of these ended out in there. A lot of Central South American countries, or some of them picked them up. Spain, Greece. I don't remember, but some of the Middle Eastern countries, I think Saudi Arabia, maybe EAU picked up these. So both of those tanks had export market. One of the advantages the Leopard had in terms of the export market was when these tanks both went into production for their own militaries, the Germans had excess industrial capacity for export orders. The French did not. So that was one of the problems that the French had. And there is actually very interesting that also just came out recently, AMX-30 Haynes Manual that just came out. Because there's really not a ton written on the AMX-30 in English either. So, interesting book. And then, of course, the other competitor on the international arms market would be the USM-60 series, which sold quite well as well, but generally more to countries that were getting U.S. military aid in the first place. And the British Chieftain sold a bit, but definitely was not as successful on the export market as the Leopard 2, easily. So yeah, the Leopard 2 was kind of the second generation of the Western world tanks. It's kind of king of the hill in terms of export success. In terms of total numbers, probably second only to the U.S. stuff, because of course West Germany maintained a pretty large tank fleet. Since they're on the front line there, the Warsaw Pact right on their border. So yeah, the Leopard. It's the Toyota Camry of tanks. Alright, well that is my long, rambling explanation of Leopard. Hope people enjoyed this, and don't go too stir-crazy like me, where I just sit in front of a camera talking about a tank for half an hour or whatever, because I can't go anywhere anyhow. Stay safe, stay inside, and we'll catch you all later.